Hi guys, this is the second read aloud of the BFG by Roald Dahl. The first one, we read the first three chapters of the book. So if you haven't seen that video, go back and find the first one so you can hear the first few chapters. And we're going to read two more chapters. This first chapter is called The Cave. The giant ran on, but now a curious change took place in the way he was running. He seemed suddenly to go into higher gear. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was traveling at such a high speed the landscape began to blur. The wind stung Sophie's cheeks and made her eyes water. It whipped her head back and whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation they were flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were over land or over sea. The giant had some sort of magic in his legs. The wind rushing against Sophie's face became so strong that she had to duck down again into the blanket to prevent her head from being blown away. Was it really possible that they were crossing oceans? It certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket and listened to the howling of winds. It went on for what seemed like hours. You can see the illustration down here. There's the giant and his long cloak, and he's running. There's his trumpet and suitcase, and in this tiny little sack right here made out of the bed sheets is Sophie. Then, all at once, the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked her head up out of the blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally. Although normal is a silly word to use to describe a galloping giant. He leaped over a dozen rivers. He went rattling through a great forest, and then down into a valley and up over a range of hills as bare as concrete. And soon he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth. The ground was flat and pale yellow. Great lumps of blue rocks were scattered all around. The dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. The moon had long since disappeared, and now the dawn was breaking. Sophie was still peering out from the blankets, saw suddenly ahead of her a great craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it the sky was gushing and glistening with light. Bits of pale gold were flying around the delicate frosty white flakes of clouds, and over to one side the rim of the morning sun was coming up, red as blood. Right beneath the mountain the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. His chest was heaving in and out, and he paused to catch his breath. Directly in front of them, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round table. It was as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as a football. And now, where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large the giant didn't even have to duck his head when he went in. He strode into the black hole, still carrying Sophie in one hand, the trumpet and the suitcase in the other. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place so that the entrance to the secret cave was completely hidden from the outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside the cave. All was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away. Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. "He is going to eat me," Sophie told herself. "He will probably eat me raw, just as I am. Or perhaps he'll boil me first. Or he'll have me fried. He will drop me like a rasher of bacon into some gigantic frying pan sizzling with fat." A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cavern high with a high rocky roof and walls on either side that were lined with shelves. And on the shelves there stood up upon row and row of glass jars. There are all those shelves with the glass jars, and down here is Sophie. She's so little compared to all of those shelves and glass jars. There were jars everywhere. They were piled up in the corners. They filled every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor there was a table 12 feet high and a chair to match. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing a sort of collarless shirt and a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were far too short for his legs. On his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that, for some reason, had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie, crouching on the floor of the cave in her night tie, which I think night tie is another word for a nightgown or pajamas, gazed back at him through thick steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. What has us got here?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. Next chapter. This says the BFG. I wonder what BFG means. I bet it will tell us in this chapter. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. Now he really is going to eat me, Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like a huge slice of white bread. "Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man-gobbling cannibal?" he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibal and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there, us has been famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant crunches up two woofy human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-busting. Noise of crunching bones goes crackety-crack for miles around." "Ouch," said Sophie. "Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from Turkey," the giant said. "Every night Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble up Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she became quite angry. "Why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English?" So Turkey is it's like the name of an animal, but it's also a country where people live. We live in the United States, and Sophie lives in another country called England. So we would call Sophie English. So she's saying, why is he going to go eat people in another country when there's people to eat here in England? What's wrong with us that he doesn't want to eat the English people? Which, if I was English, I'd be glad he was going somewhere else to eat people. "Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasty, oh, ever so much juicier and more scrum-diddly-umptious." That's a fun word. "Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamourly flavor. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey." "I suppose they would," Sophie said. "Of course they would," the giant shouted. "Every human being is diddly indifferent. Some is scrum-diddly-umptious and some is ucky slush." Those are funny words. Scrum-diddly-umptious and ucky slush. Greeks is full of ucky slush. No giant is eating Greeks ever. Why not? Sophie asked. Greeks from Greece is tasting all greasy, the giant said. I imagine that's possible too, Sophie said. She was wondering with a bit of a tremble what all this talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this particular giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food. As I am saying, the giant went on, all human beings is having different flavors. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong of hats. Why hats? Sophie said. You is not very clever, the giant said, moving his great ears in and out. I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bundle. I think that's a made-up thing. I've never heard of that. Do you like vegetables? Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food. And there they are talking. Look how big that giant is. He is humongous. And there's Sophie so little on the table. You is trying to change the subject, the giant said sternly. We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of human beings. The human being is not a vegetable. Oh, but a bean is a vegetable, Sophie said. Not the human being, the giant said. The human being has two legs and a vegetable has no legs at all. Sophie didn't argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was make the giant cross. Cross is another word for angry. She did not want to make him upset. The human being, the giant went on, is coming in dillions of different flavors. For instance, human beings from Wales is tasting very whooshously of fish. There's something very fishy about Wales. You mean whales? Sophie said. Whales is something quite different. So there's two things that kind of sound like whales. There's whales, which is the animal that lives in the ocean. And then there's Wales, which is a country. So again, like Turkey, two different things that are the same word, or almost the same word. Whales and whales, the giant said. Don't gobbly-funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has the most distinguishable woolly tickle on the tongue, the giant said. Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigans. You mean Jersey? So Jersey is a place, and jersey is a type of fabric. You are once again gobble-funking, the giant shouted. Don't do it. This is serious and snitching subjects. May I continue? Please do, Sophie said. Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs, the giant went on. Of course, they taste of Great Danes. Wrong, cried the giant, slapping his thighs. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they're tasting like Labradors. Then what do people from Labrador taste of? Sophie asked. Danes, the giant cried triumphantly. Great Danes. Aren't you getting a bit mixed up? Sophie said. I is a very mixed up giant, the giant said, but I does do my best. And I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper. Ooh, let's show you this picture too, this illustration. There's the giant. Ooh, look how big his ears are. Whoa. Wellington, Sophie said. Where is Wellington? Your head is full of squashed flies, the giant said. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington is especially scrumdiddlyumptious taste. So says the welly-eating giant. What do people of Wellington taste of? Sophie asked. Boots, the giant said. Of course, Sophie said. I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done with right away than be kept hanging around anymore. What what sort of human beings do you eat? She asked. Me? Shouted the giant, his voice mighty, making the jars rattle on the shelves. Me gobbling up human beings? This I never! The others? Yes. All the others is gobbling up every night, but not me. I is a freaky giant. I is a nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big, friendly giant. I is the BFG. Oh, big, F friendly, giant G. BFG means big, friendly giant. What is your name? My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news she had just heard. She's probably very, very excited to hear that he does not eat humans. So now we have a new chapter, but we're going to wait and keep reading a little more later. Bye!